Looking Between the Extremes with Emma Pratt Richens, AliCamp 2022. AliCamp would like to thank our gold sponsors Intopia, Salesforce and Telstra, and silver sponsors ANZ, Deloitte Digital and Coles.
Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you enjoy what I have to share and the scenery I recently had the pleasure to visit and photograph. I'm Emma Pratt Richens, an accessibility specialist and consultant. I started specialising in accessibility about 7 years ago while working at the BBC. For 15 years before that, I worked as a front-end web designer and developer. Back in the Jurassic era of table-based layouts, it was adapting for the different screen sizes and font sizes. That transition to well-structured semantic HTML with CSS for styling and some other requested considerations to make a government website accessible. Then there were template-based dynamic responsive websites that needed to work for keyboard, screen readers, mouse, touch, mobile, and pre-reading age children. And my evolution to advising on the accessibility of digital interfaces that are now moving to be component-based. Making interfaces work for the variety of users I was aware of has underpinned my career so far. The difference now, compared to 20 years ago, is that I'm aware of so many more users. Perhaps with accessibility, the penny drop moment for me was about 12 years ago. I was already a conscientious developer trying to do the best with what I knew and understood. I was aware there were screen reader users who benefited from certain things in the code, and that some people navigated with keyboard or tools that could emulate keyboards. I took up an opportunity to watch some user research that had been organised. Its intention was to better understand how children navigated around the sections of the BBC's website that was aimed at 6 to 12-year-olds. The children being observed in the research lab were asked to explain out loud everything that they were reading and doing, and then instructed to navigate to a game that they liked. They could play for a few minutes and were then asked to navigate to another game. One lad had very thick spectacles and would have to position his head just so to be able to read the screen. However, he was very capable and fluent reader. He played a few games and then decided to try one with a, keep the characters happy mechanic. The instructions came up and he positioned his head and started to read. And halfway through reading, they automatically advanced to the next section before he could finish, and he couldn't navigate back. He tried, and so he didn't read the second section before it too advanced, or the third. Consequently, he didn't know how to play the game, and someone had to tell him. Meanwhile, I'd read through each set of instructions twice before it changed, and I understood the code that was creating the problem. Someone had gone to a lot of effort to code a timed auto-advance feature. A skip or next button would have been much easier to code, and a skip or next button would have allowed the impatient 10-year-old me to skip through as fast as I wanted to instead of being bored waiting, which I recall being a frustration from my own childhood gaming in the 1980s. A skip or next button would have allowed this young lad to take as much time as he needed. I realized it would have been better for everyone, for anyone. The image here is an example of game instructions with next and previous buttons. And there it was. Accessibility is about everyone. Making things work for everyone so that everyone can join in. Everyone also includes people for whom lack of consideration often disables their ability to join in. It makes it not accessible. Everyone includes power users for whom the same solutions can improve their experience. Everyone from one extreme through no extremes and right out the other side. And we have a goal. But how do we get there? the pictures of a American football game. The first time I spoke at a big event, which happened to be CSUN, one of my presentations was about accessibility starting with design and designing for everyone. I'm aware that others had spoken about this before, and I have heard that point reiterated by many speakers since. One of the earliest examples of accessible design is the drop curb, like in the picture. It was introduced in the UK in the 1930s and in the US in the 1940s. Seiichi Miyake, hope I pronounced that right, later developed tactile paving in 1965, commonly used with drop curbs to make them more accessible for blind users. The term barrier-free design was first used in the 1950s, with specifications published in 1960, after 11 years of research into disability ergonomics. And Selwyn Goldsmith's book, Designing for the Disabled, was first published in 1963. The 1960s also saw some of the first legislation around disability rights. During the 1970s, architect Ronald Mace started using the term universal design, designing buildings, products, or environments to be accessible to all people, regardless of age, ability, and status. Its principles cover more than accessible design and barrier-free design, the background from which it evolved. And this was followed by further legislation in the 1990s, things like ADA and the Equality Act in the UK. In 2004, the phrase "design for all" was used in an EU declaration, adding applicability to products, services, and systems. To some extent, the terms universal design and design for all are fairly interchangeable. Meanwhile, the advancing digital technologies of the 70s and 80s gave rise to the term inclusive design, which is maturing alongside the internet. Though the outcome may be similar to universal design, inclusive design focuses more on the process. Susan Goldsman defines inclusive design as designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging, rather than one thing for all people. After extensively applying what had been a largely academic practice, Microsoft came to consider inclusive design to be a methodology that enables and draws the full range of enables and draws on the full range of human diversity. Most importantly, this means including and learning from people with a range of perspectives. Kat Holmes considers inclusive design a method, a process. It is not the outcome. It might make things more accessible, but it is not a process for meeting accessibility standards or legal requirements. Where universal design works to define and describe the qualities of a final design, inclusive design focuses on how to get there. Universal design seeks a solution that works for the widest range of people without any adaptations. Inclusive design seeks out the expert advice of people being excluded. Nothing about us without us, right? The steps of inclusive design are to recognize exclusion, solve for one, and extend to many, a bit like the picture, and to learn from diversity, to optimize for a specific user with specific needs, often at an extreme previously overlooked. In theory, ensuring a design works for a specific user will also benefit other users with less extreme but similar needs. So inclusive design, a good premise that has led to some great improvements in products, should be about everyone. In the video, BBC for Everyone, that is available on the BBC website, experts Molly Watt and Esmail Patel explain something rather well. I'll leave it up to them to explain it.
In the world of design specifically, people put people into boxes. So you have, the visually impaired people, hearing impaired people, motor, cognitive, vision, hearing, motor, cognitive. And I don't think about the grey areas in between. So for instance, people stereotype and think, okay, blind people can't see a thing and deaf people use sign language.
The deaf community,
Esmail, signs
includes profoundly deaf people, people with mild deafness, people with severe deafness, people with hearing loss. We're not one homogeneous group. It's a very diverse community.
Although I'm registered deaf-blind, I can communicate orally and quite well, and I do have some sight, and people find that quite shocking. Like, wow, how can you be blind and still look at my face?
People are just not the same. Several times during the year prior to first giving this presentation, I found myself wondering about the users between the extremes. The extremes of always needing and using accessibility features and never needing or using accessibility features. You'll note from the standard deviation bell curve here that about 47% of people fall on each side of average. Between the average and the extremes, that's over 90% of the total. I wondered, are there things about the experience of someone between that are specific to them that the stuff for the extremes simply doesn't cover? Are we being as inclusive as we could be? Because we can't be for everyone except you or that person over there. Throughout my career, I have been privileged to observe user research or meet people with diverse user requirements many times. Every time has brought unexpected insights and better understanding. Since specializing in accessibility, working alongside design research teams, I've come to truly appreciate how invaluable learning from research and lived experience is. You are not your user. You are definitely not all of your users. And no matter how experienced or knowledgeable you are, you cannot know all the experiences and nuances and preferences of all your users. I'd like to run through just a few examples that I'm aware of that illustrate the point that I'm trying to make and are part of what got me thinking about this. Because user insights are blue mountain moments. They kind of expand your view. Picture of the Blue Mountains. User research is invaluable. So, case study 1, the learners. During my last year with the BBC, the iPlayer mobile team were trying to improve the controls interface for the BBC's media player. For those who don't know, iPlayer is the BBC's on-demand service and can be accessed on their website, via mobile and tablet apps, on televisions, on games consoles, and a number of other platforms. The team had already done some user consultation and other research sessions in the lab. This time, they wanted to run some user research with experienced screen reader users to find out what they thought of the new interface. The team observed 10 users over 2 days. There was some frustration as various of the users being observed were needing a bit of support to control the screen reader. As it turned out, only 2 of the 10 users recruited were what the team considered to be experienced screen reader users. However, during those 2 days, the researchers learned much more from the 8 less experienced screen reader users than the 2 who knew what they were doing and could easily navigate the controls. For example, one lady that I observed talked about how she used to control the player when she could see better, and she expected the screen reader control to function in a similar way. Another person was familiar with the basic gestures, but not the other supported gestures that could make the interface easier to use. Through the sessions, there were several exclamations of, "Ooh, I didn't know it could do that. Those who are still learning technology or languages have a very different approach from those who are expert users. Many bring prior knowledge and experience of doing other things into an interaction and have gaps in their knowledge of the technology or language that they are learning. Case study 2, heredity and environment. Some years ago, the BBC Children's Games team established and built ongoing relationships with nearby special schools, in particular a couple of schools for blind children and another that also has deaf, learning and physically disabled children. Two patterns were noted here. First, many of those children are late learning to read or use assistive technology like screen readers, not because they aren't capable of learning, but because they have to learn other things first. For example, a child who is blind needs to learn Braille to learn how to read for themselves, whereas a visually impaired child needs Zoom and simpler backgrounds. And a child who speaks sign language needs to learn the spoken language and then learn to associate groups of letters with signs, and they often can't learn to read phonetically. Whereas a child with some hearing loss is likely to learn sign-supported language. Second, children who are the first in their family with their specific disabilities are often aware of and using the latest assistive technologies, while those who have parents with similar disabilities often have family-established ways that they do things and are not seeking to do things differently. There is no expectation to do things like someone without a disability. So despite the potential for new technology to improve accessibility, things like augmented reality, virtual reality, wearable tech, haptics, artificial intelligence, voice, and even mind control, there is sometimes a challenge in making those who could most benefit from it aware of what is available to them and to get them interested. A situation perhaps exacerbated by costs that may make people hesitant to try new stuff or upgrade existing stuff, or even to try new stuff again if it hasn't been great the first time that they tried it. Case study 3, milder impairments. In 2019, the BBC Weather team did some research to learn about the natural behaviour of users with visual impairment, along with the perceived clarity and comprehension of the content. They ran a couple of different phases with visually impaired users, some of whom were blind, some of whom had low vision or dyslexia. Among those with milder impairments, they found that contrast, particularly with ambient backgrounds in the mobile app, had a big impact on usability. Text size and zoom can impact on layout and how much of the content is seen. The size of icons had significant impact on clarity and understanding, especially for those not using screen readers and not hearing the text alternative, which in turn affected which parts of the interface that they preferred and used more. Blind users were, not surprisingly perhaps, not natural map users and were a bit irked at having to use one or interact with one, possibly because they were not seeing that it affected the information timeline. And there is definitely a case for too much information at once, where visual clutter becomes overwhelming or difficult to pick out relevant detail from. Case study 4, the hackers. When chatting with one of the researchers at BBC Children's, I learned about some great life hacks. One blind lad shut himself in a room for a couple of days with a new iPad and used his Alexa to learn how to use it and enable voice control. Another young lass with cerebral palsy would use speech instead of typing to search for content on her tablet or their television. And a youngster who prefers AAC with icons because he doesn't read well enough yet, but whose communication is then limited by the PEC cards that are available to him. Don't underestimate people with disabilities or others who may hack their environment and use things in unexpected ways. There are many hackers out there coming up with all sorts of creative ways to use stuff to get around accessibility barriers, or simply use things in ways that were not expected. Like my friend, a blind programmer called Ben Mustel-Rose, who created skills for his Alexa that would monitor his plants and let him know when they needed watered, and let him know when it was dark outside so that he knew when to shut his curtains. Case study 5, nuances. Another BBC researcher shared some insights from other research for the Own It app. It's an app that's based around mental health and reporting on your feelings using emoji icons. The research included some autistic kids to see how they understood what different emoji represent. Some understood very literally, while others understood but didn't associate the emoji with their own feelings. The app also provides a custom keyboard that kicks in when typing in other apps, like social media or email. It uses manually crafted AI to assess how a message could come across and suggests changing words or changing the wording when that triggers. This time, however, it's the AI that it sometimes misunderstands or misses a nuance of speech. In other research around subtitles in kids' games, and with an intention of making those subtitles clearer and more engaging, instead, they found that deaf kids don't use subtitles in games because the grammar is so different to sign language. Instead, they just try out the different controls and techniques and use visual cues to help them figure it out. The hackers again. And there is so much more within that Sydney-shaped bell curve. This is a photo of Sydney Opera House from the harbour. At the ID24 2019 event, Elizabeth Schaefer gave a great talk on cognitive differences. She highlighted the challenge for people who find too much motion distracting, but would still benefit from motion that is meaningful and helps them to understand how to interact with the content. It's great that the prefers reduced motion setting is available to apps, but it isn't fine-tuned enough. It kind of needs an in-between setting. She also wondered, for people who are losing abilities slowly, at which point do they consider themselves disabled? When do they start thinking that the settings hidden under an accessibility or disability label, as pictured here, would be useful for them? Some other things. For someone with memory difficulty, those active and visited pseudostates can be very helpful. Make sure you use them. For people on older devices or limited bandwidth and tariffs, those big images and autoplay videos are a huge problem. Make a way to optimize them. Blind and visually impaired people are unlikely to have driving licenses as ID. Let them use an alternative. Deaf people are less likely to prefer a phone call. The same with some people with cognitive or mental health conditions. Provide another way for them to contact you. Some people have conditions that are not the same from one part of the day to the next, so they will pick and mix the different accessibility tools and settings that they use through the day. At ID24 this year, Linda Keating talked about minority language speakers and how they often want to use multiple languages within the same interface and frequently can't. And people have many additional conditions or situations that impact in really unexpected ways, or might be using an app or a website in a way that you didn't expect them to, or maybe just no longer have access to an email address that's linked to their slides.com account, making your password reset feature impossible to use. That was my panic moment last week. Provide a different way to do that thing. And not everything in life is a manly beach like this photo. Even the most charmed life will have moments of crisis, and for many, there is unfortunately longer impacting trauma. These things also need to be considered when designing, so as to simplify user journeys most likely to be used during crisis, and to avoid unnecessary trigger moments related to past trauma. Eric A. Meyer has shared experiences from when his daughter Rebecca took ill and later died, and Sarah Vactor-Boettcher has both spoken and written about her own experience and significant moments when the tech industry has got it wrong because of blind spots and biases. Both speak of how more considered design could have really helped in those difficult situations. And at this year's ID24, Melissa Eggleston spoke about trauma-informed design. She pointed out that when researching trauma, it is vital to be mindful of the well-being not only of those that you speak with, but also those doing the research and yourself. A point that I feel is worth amplifying when encouraging wide-ranging learning from others' lived experiences, because it can be emotional stuff. Back in the late 1940s, during the early years of jet planes, the US Air Force had a serious problem with pilots keeping control of their planes. Eventually, their attention turned to the cockpit design. Research was commissioned to improve the calculations and measurements for an average pilot. After measuring over 4,000 pilots, what the research found was that no pilot closely matched the average for all measurements. There was no average pilot. So designing for one average pilot created something that fit no one. No one is average. The result was adjustable seating and instrument panels. People do not come as tidy, repeatable templates. In fact, they are usually a patchwork of different traits and needs. Perhaps inclusive design as a process and universal design as an ideal both need to be much more inclusive. Or perhaps there are simply more extremes, more individuals to solve for than we realized. Accessibility really is about everyone, about ensuring that everyone has access to join in. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. These slides and my speaker notes are available at slides.com/emmajpr/looking-between. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me via Twitter. Keep safe and keep well.
AliCamp 2022.